Do you remember a time when you were treated as if your presence didn't matter, like you were invisible? Even when you had every right to be there, it doesn't take shouting or insults to cut deep. Sometimes, all it takes is a small denial, delivered with a polite smile, to remind you that someone has decided you're not worthy. On this flight, a man sat quietly in first class, ticket confirmed, meal pre-ordered. Yet, when dinner arrived, he was handed a box while others enjoyed champagne and fine entrees. A simple moment, but one filled with meaning. Was it just a mistake or a message? And here lies the choice. Accept the humiliation in silence, or let dignity speak louder than comfort. What would you have done if all eyes were on you? This story is not only about one flight, it's about the quiet battles we all face, the ones that reveal who we are when respect is denied. Stay with me, because what happened next turned a silent insult into a storm that shook the entire system. If this resonates, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so together we can keep uncovering stories that matter. The air inside the cabin of Skylux Flight 708 was calm, almost serene. Outside, late autumn sunlight spilled across the tarmac of JFK International, stretching long golden lines through the oval windows of the aircraft. The first-class cabin smelled faintly of polished leather and roasted coffee, the kind of atmosphere airlines like to market as exclusive serenity. Every seat gleamed with brushed aluminum and soft cream upholstery. David Langston settled into 2A. At 52, his presence carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen too much to waste words. His dark tailored suit fit neatly across broad shoulders, but there was nothing flashy about him. No gold watch, no diamond cufflinks, just a plain silver wedding band, a leather-bound notebook tucked beside him, and a calmness that seemed at odds with the constant buzz of business travelers around him. He was used to people underestimating him. Sometimes he even preferred it. It gave him space to observe, to measure the world without the burden of expectation. Still, he had chosen first class for a reason. This was not leisure. He had a critical meeting in San Francisco with aerospace partners, the kind of conversation that decided the future of technology contracts worth billions. He had requested a specific meal ahead of time, pan-seared salmon with seasonal vegetables, prepared to accommodate his dietary restrictions. It wasn't indulgence, it was necessity. Around him, other passengers were busy with their rituals. A middle-aged man in 2B noisily flipped through stock reports. Across the aisle, a young woman scrolled endlessly on her phone, giggling at something only she could see. 2 rows ahead, a pair of executives clinked champagne flutes, already half into their second bottle. David leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and listened to the low hum of the engines warming up. Flying had always been bittersweet. As a child in Georgia, he remembered pressing his face to the chain-link fence near the old regional airport, watching planes lift off into the sky. Back then, flying seemed like freedom itself, untouchable, limitless. But adulthood had taught him the truth inside these cabins. Freedom was unevenly distributed. The click of heels interrupted his thoughts. Carla Bennett, the lead flight attendant, strode down the aisle with the brisk confidence of someone who had spent years policing the invisible boundaries of class and privilege. Her uniform was flawless, every line pressed sharp, her blonde hair tied in a perfect twist. She stopped at David's row, her eyes flicking over him briefly before she reached down. Without a word, she placed a small cardboard box on his tray table. The box was unremarkable, plain white, with the airline's logo stamped in blue. When David opened it, he found a lukewarm turkey sandwich wrapped in plastic, a bag of pretzels, and a bottle of water. For a moment, silence hung between them. David looked at the box, then back at Carla. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice even. "I had pre-ordered the salmon entree. Could you check if it's been loaded?" Carla's lips curved into a polite but thin smile. "We've made adjustments, sir. That option isn't available for you today." Her tone was clipped, final. He raised an eyebrow. "Not available. For me." "Yes," she replied, straightening her posture. "We reserve premium selections for certain passengers. I'm sure you understand." Her words landed heavier than the sandwich box itself. Across the aisle, the woman with the phone paused, glancing up briefly before looking away. One of the champagne-drinking executives chuckled under his breath. The man in 2B smirked, as though silently agreeing with the crew's decision. David said nothing. He simply closed the box with care, his fingers steady, his face unreadable. Inside, though, something stirred. Not anger, at least not the kind that showed. It was that old familiar echo from years gone by, the memory of being 16, walking into a diner with his friends, only to be told there were no seats available. The way the waitress's eyes had skimmed over their brown skin before deciding they didn't belong. He had swallowed that humiliation, just as he had swallowed countless others. But every time, it etched itself deeper, a quiet ledger of wrongs written beneath his skin. Now, here he was, decades later, sitting in first class on a flight paid for in full, being told again that he didn't belong. Carla had already moved on, pouring champagne for the executives 2 rows ahead, laughing lightly at one of their jokes. David watched her for a moment, then glanced around the cabin. Some passengers pretended not to notice. Others looked directly at him, curiosity in their eyes. No one said a word. He exhaled slowly, controlled. Then he reached into his bag, pulled out his slim black laptop, and placed it on the tray table beside the untouched sandwich. The glow of the screen lit his face, casting sharp lines against the calm mask he wore. No one else knew it, but this was the moment the flight began to change. Because David Langston was not just another passenger. He was the CEO of NextCore Technologies, the company that had designed the very security and data system Skylux Airlines depended on. And, while the rest of the cabin saw only a man with a sandwich, David was already reaching into the infrastructure of the airline itself. The engines roared as the plane began taxiing toward the runway. The passengers adjusted their seat belts, preparing for takeoff. David's hands rested lightly on the keyboard. His eyes, though calm, held the glint of something sharper. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for truth. And truth, he knew, had a way of finding its way to the surface whether people wanted it or not. The sandwich remained untouched. The plane lifted smoothly from the runway, the lights of New York fading into a scatter of jewels below. Passengers settled into the quiet rhythm of ascent seat backs adjusted, headphones slipped on, glasses refilled. The first-class cabin carried the muted hum of comfort, but at seat 2A, comfort was conspicuously absent. David Langston sat with his laptop closed now, the faint reflection of city lights fading from the dark screen. The untouched sandwich box still rested on his tray table, a silent witness to what had just happened. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his mind moved in quiet precision, cataloging every word, every detail. The man in 2B finally spoke, tilting his head toward David. "You know," he said with a smirk, "you shouldn't expect too much. Airlines have their priorities." He chuckled at his own words, then returned to his reports as if the conversation were finished before it began. David gave no response. His silence was not submission. It was strategy. Words, he had learned long ago, were tools. The right ones built bridges. The wrong ones burned them. Sometimes the sharpest statement was made by refusing to speak at all. 2 rows up, Carla Bennett leaned lightly against the galley wall, speaking in low tones to another attendant. She didn't glance back toward David, but her voice carried just enough for him to catch pieces. "Some passengers. You can tell who belongs here and who doesn't." Her companion murmured agreement, and the clink of champagne flutes followed. David's eyes drifted to the window, thousands of feet below. The dark Atlantic stretched endlessly. Flying at 35,000 feet should have felt liberating, but tonight it carried the same weight as the diner in Georgia, the same weight as boardrooms where his ideas were questioned until repeated by someone else. Some injustices didn't stay on the ground. They followed you into the sky. A hand appeared beside him, hesitant but deliberate. "Sir," a softer voice said, "would you like another drink, tea, coffee?" It was Nina Torres. Her posture was careful, her dark eyes darting quickly toward Carla before returning to David. She was new enough that the creases in her uniform still looked freshly pressed, her hair pinned neatly, her movements precise. David looked at her, recognizing the struggle written across her face. He shook his head. "Thank you. I'm fine." His tone was gentle, almost reassuring. Nina lingered for a moment, as though she wanted to say more, then quickly retreated down the aisle. Her silence was not indifference, it was fear. David understood that fear. It was the weight of hierarchy pressing down on conscience, the kind of weight that made good people complicit. Minutes passed. The cabin returned to its rhythm of quiet chatter and muted entertainment screens. The smell of rosemary chicken and filet mignon drifted through the air. Each plate carried carefully to other passengers. Silver cutlery clinked softly against porcelain dishes. The contrast between the gourmet meals and the lonely sandwich on David's tray grew starker with every passing moment. Carla eventually returned to his row, her expression polished into professional neutrality. "Is there a problem with the meal, sir?" she asked, her tone laced with practiced courtesy. David met her gaze evenly. "The problem," he said quietly, "isn't the meal." Her smile tightened, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, if you'd prefer, I can see if we have another sandwich available." This time, a ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. A woman across the aisle raised her eyebrows, then quickly lowered them when Carla's gaze flicked in her direction. The executives up front laughed a little louder, their voices carrying a note of forced cheer, as if they wanted to distance themselves from the tension. David leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. He did not argue. He did not demand. But the quiet in his eyes unsettled Carla more than any raised voice could have. She shifted on her heels, then turned briskly away, her perfume lingering faintly in the air. The man in 2B stole another glance at David. For the first time, his smirk faltered. Something in David's calm unsettled him too. He tapped his pen nervously against his notepad, pretending to focus on his numbers. David closed his eyes briefly, drawing in a slow breath. He could hear his mother's voice, warm but firm. From decades ago, David, the world will test your dignity in small ways and in great ones. Never let them take it from you." He had carried those words into every meeting, every negotiation, every confrontation, and now, here at 35,000 feet, he carried them still. The seatbelt sign dinged softly as the plane leveled off. Carla's voice floated through the intercom, cheerful and composed, reminding passengers to relax and enjoy the flight. The irony was not lost on David. Relaxation was a privilege unevenly distributed, just like the meals. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly, David opened his laptop again. His fingers hovered briefly over the keys before he began typing a string of encrypted commands. The screen filled with cascading lines of code, subtle enough to look like harmless work to anyone glancing over his shoulder. But these commands were not ordinary. They were reaching into the architecture of Skylux itself. A soft ping confirmed the connection. David leaned back once more, eyes calm, posture steady. Outwardly, he looked like any other passenger reviewing business documents. Inwardly, he was setting in motion an audit that would reach every corner of this flight before it touched the ground. No one else noticed. Not Carla, not the executives, not the man in 2B. Only David knew the truth, and maybe, somewhere deep down, Nina sensed it too. The sandwich remained untouched. From her post in the galley, Nina Torres felt the weight in her chest grow heavier with every step she took down the aisle. She had been in the job less than a year, and still she carried that mixture of excitement and nerves every time she pinned her name badge and smoothed the lines of her navy blue uniform. But tonight, the excitement had drained from her the moment she saw what Carla did. She had watched the scene unfold with her own eyes, the carefully packed first-class meals being served to everyone else, while Mr. Langston received nothing but a boxed sandwich. Nina had checked the manifest earlier that morning, scrolling through the screen as she reviewed dietary restrictions and special requests. His name was right there, plain and clear, with the salmon entree attached. There had been no mistake, yet Carla had ignored it. Not only ignored it, but dismissed it with a tone Nina knew all too well. The kind of tone that divided people into categories without ever saying the words aloud. Nina busied herself with reorganizing the drink cart, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged bottles of sparkling water into neat rows. She could hear Carla laughing up front, sharing a light conversation with the executives in 1A and 1B. The laughter rang out like a signal Carla had already chosen, whose comfort mattered most on this flight. A small voice inside Nina whispered, "Say something. This isn't right." But the louder voice, one she had heard since her training days, warned her of the consequences. Carla had the ear of management. Carla had tenure. Carla could make or break a junior attendant's career. She stole another glance down the aisle at David Langston. He sat still, composed, his hands resting on his laptop, his gaze calm but unreadable. Nina couldn't imagine what it must feel like to be treated that way in a cabin designed to make people feel important. He had paid the same as everyone else, maybe more. Yet here he was, denied something as basic as the meal he ordered. She remembered her own father, who had spent years working 2 jobs just to keep their family afloat. He had told her once, while sitting at the kitchen table after a long shift, Mia, "Respect isn't about money. It's about dignity. If you take that away from someone, you take away the thing they need most." The thought pressed hard against her conscience. An older woman in 3C leaned across the aisle and whispered to Nina as she passed, That gentleman in 2A. Shouldn't he have a proper meal? The question carried concern, not gossip. Nina opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't contradict Carla in front of passengers. "Let me check on something," Nina replied softly, retreating before the woman could ask further. In the galley, she pulled the manifest up again on her tablet. There it was, Langston, David, salmon entree confirmed. No ambiguity, no missing note. Nina bit her lip, staring at the screen until the lines blurred. Her thumb hovered over the intercom switch to call the cockpit, to report the discrepancy. But her courage faltered. What if Carla found out? What if it was reported as insubordination? The fear was real. She thought about rent, about student loans, about the cost of helping her younger brother through community college. Fear had a way of silencing even the truest intentions. She tucked the tablet away and returned to service, her smile polite but strained. Every clink of silverware in the cabin felt like a reminder of her silence. When she passed by David's row again, she caught his eye briefly. He didn't look angry, didn't even look surprised. He simply looked at her in a way that made her feel seen, as though he could read every hesitation in her mind. She quickly lowered her gaze, moving on. But a few minutes later, as she tidied the galley once more, her tablet buzzed softly. A new notification appeared, one she had never seen before. It wasn't from the airline system. It was a simple line of text, glowing against the dark screen. "Speak the truth. We are watching." Her breath caught. She looked around, half expecting someone to be standing there, but the galley was empty. Her fingers hovered above the screen, uncertain whether to clear the message or respond. But there was no option to reply. It had come through some hidden channel, one she couldn't identify. Her heart raced. Who had sent it? What did it mean for the rest of the meal service? Nina moved mechanically, her mind spinning. She replayed Carla's words, David's calm response, the uneasy glances from other passengers. And now, this message a reminder that silence was itself a choice. She carried trays of desserts down the aisle, her hands steady despite the storm inside. The man in 2B devoured his chocolate soufflé noisily, while David's tray table remained bare, save for the untouched sandwich box. As she reached his row, she hesitated. For a moment, she considered leaning down and whispering something, an apology, a reassurance, anything. But Carla's presence loomed only a few feet away, her sharp eyes tracking every move. Nina straightened, set her jaw, and continued past. Still, the message on her tablet pulsed in her mind. Speak the truth. She wondered if she would have the courage when the time came. The cabin had settled into a strange rhythm. For most passengers, it was simply another cross-country flight. They sipped their wine, tapped on laptops, or drifted off to sleep beneath fleece blankets. But, beneath the surface calm, tension pressed against the walls of Skylux 708 like unseen turbulence. David Langston sat unmoving, his posture as composed as ever, though inside he felt the air tighten with each passing minute. The sandwich remained untouched on his tray, its plastic wrapping glinting faintly under the cabin lights. It wasn't the food itself that mattered, it was the message sent along with it. A message that told him he did not belong, even here, in a seat he had earned and paid for. Carla Bennett walked the aisle with clipped precision, her heels clicking against the carpet as if each step were a punctuation mark. She stopped at rows where her laughter flowed easily, where passengers mirrored her energy, offering smiles and flattery. At David's row, her demeanor hardened. She paused, glancing at the box still on his tray. "Is there something wrong with your meal, sir?" Her tone was edged with impatience, though her words carried the veneer of customer service. David's eyes met hers. "You know what's wrong," he said quietly. The calmness in his voice unsettled her more than a raised tone would have. She shifted slightly, then leaned closer. "Look," she whispered tightly, "we have to prioritize. Not everyone gets the same treatment. That's just how it is." Across the aisle, the woman in 3C turned her head sharply at the words, catching the whisper even if Carla hadn't intended her to. She frowned, her lips parting as if she might speak, but she hesitated, biting her tongue. Carla straightened, her smile returning as quickly as it had vanished. "I'll see if there's another sandwich available," she said louder, the performance back in place for the audience around her. David didn't answer. He simply folded his hands, letting silence do the work. The man in 2B chuckled under his breath, muttering just loud enough for David to hear. "Maybe you should be grateful you got anything at all." He didn't look up from his papers as he spoke. Nina Torres, carrying a tray of beverages, froze at the comment. She glanced at David, whose expression remained unchanged, then at the man in 2B, whose smugness seemed to fill the narrow space between them. Her stomach churned. She wanted to say something. She wanted to correct Carla, to shut down the cruelty of the man beside David, to hand over the meal she knew had been assigned to him. But her tongue felt heavy. The echo of her father's words respect is about dignity rang in her ears, colliding with the fear of Carla's authority. Instead, she set down a glass of water on David's table. "Something to drink, sir?" she asked softly. David nodded. "Thank you," he replied. His voice carried a warmth that seemed meant for her alone, a quiet acknowledgement of her struggle. As Nina moved on, Carla's eyes followed her, sharp and suspicious. Carla had a way of noticing hesitation, of sniffing out weakness among the crew. She prided herself on keeping order, on ensuring no one undermined her authority. In the galley. Nina's hands trembled slightly as she set the tray down. She exhaled, trying to steady herself, but the words she had overheard would not leave her mind. Not everyone gets the same treatment. Back in his seat, David closed his eyes. Memories rose unbidden boardrooms where he had been the only black man at the table. Conferences where people assumed he was an assistant until he stood at the podium to speak. He remembered the way his mother had once pressed his hand and said, "You will be tested in ways others are not, but don't let them write your story for you." Carla passed again, noting the closed laptop on his tray. "Still working, sir?" she asked, her tone sugary now, as though mocking politeness. David opened his eyes. "No," he said evenly. "I'm watching." Something in the way he said it made her blink, as though for the first time she wasn't entirely sure of her ground. But she recovered quickly, turning away with a stiff nod. The atmosphere grew heavier as the minutes stretched. Conversations hushed whenever Carla passed. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The injustice wasn't invisible. It was simply unacknowledged. Then came a sudden jolt, the plane shifting slightly in midair as it cut through a pocket of turbulence. Glasses rattled, silverware clinked against porcelain. Carla steadied herself against a seat, her composure briefly cracking. David, however, remained perfectly still, as though the turbulence outside couldn't touch him. Nina caught his expression from where she stood near the galley. His calm wasn't passivity, it was resolve. The kind of resolve that made her wonder if something more was unfolding than anyone realized. She slipped back into the aisle, moving toward him. Her voice dropped low as she set another glass of water on his table. "Sir," she murmured, so softly only he could hear, "I checked the manifest. Your meal was confirmed." David looked up at her, his gaze steady. For a moment, Nina thought he might say something, but instead he simply inclined his head slightly, a gesture of gratitude that needed no words. Her chest tightened. She had crossed a line, however quietly. Carla would notice if she wasn't careful, but for the first time that night, Nina felt a flicker of courage burning against the fear. As she turned away, Carla's voice called from the galley, sharp and commanding Taurus. A word. The sound of her name cracked through the cabin like a whip. Nina froze mid-step, then glanced back at David. His eyes met hers again, calm but penetrating, as if reminding her of the message she'd received earlier. Speak the truth. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the galley, Carla's silhouette waiting like a shadow at the end of the aisle. The galley door closed with a soft click behind Nina, leaving the aisle momentarily quiet. David Langston sat still in his seat, eyes fixed on the reflection in the oval window. The city lights had long disappeared, replaced by the vast black stretch of night sky. A few pinpricks of stars shone above the horizon, steady and untouchable. He allowed himself a long breath, slow and measured. On the surface, he looked composed, unbothered, but inside his mind spun like a wheel catching every detail. Carla's tone, the smirk of the man in 2B, the silence of passengers who noticed but chose not to act. Each piece fit into a familiar pattern, one he had known all his life. He thought back to a diner in rural Georgia when he was 16. He and two friends had walked in after football practice, their uniforms dusty, their voices loud with teenage joy. The waitress had looked at them, her smile vanishing. She shook her head before they could sit. "We don't have space tonight," she had said, though the booths were nearly empty. They had walked out into the evening air, their laughter gone, replaced by the quiet ache of being told without words that they didn't belong. His mother had been waiting at home, a plate of cornbread on the counter, her eyes reading his mood before he spoke. "David," she had said gently, "you will carry moments like this, but you decide what they mean. Don't let them shrink you." Those words had followed him into college, into boardrooms, into every space where he was doubted or dismissed. Tonight, in this polished cabin thousands of feet above the earth, the lesson returned in sharp clarity. Carla had offered him a sandwich, but what she really handed him was a test how much of his dignity he was willing to surrender. He glanced at the box still on his tray table. The sandwich wasn't food, it was a symbol, a reminder of every door that had closed, every voice that had questioned his right to stand where he stood. He reached out, resting his fingertips on the lid, not to eat, but to remind himself of the weight it carried. From the galley came muffled voices, Carla's sharper tone, Nina's quieter responses. David couldn't hear the words, but he could sense the imbalance the pressure Carla placed on younger attendants, the way authority was used to suppress rather than guide. He knew Nina had noticed. He had seen the conflict in her eyes. His laptop screen glowed faintly, still connected to the hidden audit system. Streams of data scrolled quietly, invisible to those around him. Cabin cameras, microphone logs, passenger service records, everything was being cataloged in real time. The power of truth sat quietly in his lap, waiting, but he hesitated. Not because he doubted the evidence, but because he knew what would follow. To expose Carla's actions meant exposing the culture that allowed them. It meant shaking an entire airline, forcing accountability where silence had been the rule. He had done it before in boardrooms, but here, confined in a cabin with strangers, the stakes felt different. These were not executives. These were everyday people who would carry this story back into their lives. His mind wandered to his father, a mechanic who had worked with grease-stained hands but carried himself with quiet pride. "Son," his father had once told him, "sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you fight without raising your voice." David let those words settle in him now. He would not shout, he would not argue, but he would act. A steward passed by, clearing plates from another row. The scent of seared steak drifted past, mingling with the sterile air. David caught the glance of the woman in 3C again. This time she did not look away. Her eyes held sympathy, even a spark of indignation. For a brief second, he felt less alone. The man in 2B shifted noisily, elbow brushing David's armrest. "You're awfully quiet," he muttered. "Guess you know better than to make a scene." He smirked again, pleased with himself. David turned his head slowly, meeting the man's eyes. "Silence doesn't mean acceptance," he said calmly. "It means I'm choosing the right moment." The man blinked, unsettled by the firmness beneath the even tone. He shifted back in his seat, suddenly less sure of his mockery. David returned his gaze to the window. Outside, the horizon stretched endlessly, the curve of the earth faint under the stars. He thought of the generations before him, those who had endured worse indignities with no power to challenge them. Tonight, he had the power. He carried not only his own dignity, but theirs as well. From the galley, footsteps approached. Nina reappeared, her face pale but her eyes steadier than before. She carried a tray of coffee cups, her hands no longer trembling. When she set one on David's table, she whispered so quietly it was almost breath. "I'm sorry." David met her gaze, given a small nod. "The truth has a way of finding its place," he murmured back. Nina's lips pressed together, but her eyes shone with something new resolve. She straightened and walked on, her steps more purposeful now. David leaned back, the hum of the engines filling the silence. He felt the quiet ledger inside him grow heavier. But this time, it was balanced by something else. Not just the injustice, but the certainty that this moment would not end in silence. His fingers tapped lightly against the laptop keys, entering another encrypted command. A subtle notification pinged in the corner of the screen, audit engaged, evidence secured. He closed the laptop gently, his decision made. The moment would come soon enough. The steady hum of engines filled the cabin, a background rhythm that most passengers no longer noticed. But for David Langston, every vibration seemed sharper, every sound more precise. His senses were tuned not to the comfort of the flight, but to the quiet power pulsing in the machine balanced on his tray table. The glow of his laptop was faint, his fingers resting lightly on the keys as lines of code whispered across the screen like a language only he understood. He had designed these systems for moments exactly like this, not for revenge, not for petty grievances, but for accountability. NextCore Technologies had built its reputation on transparency and truth, on the ability to capture what others ignored. Skylux Airlines depended on his company's architecture to monitor safety, to protect data, to ensure compliance. What they didn't know was that tonight, the same architecture was recording more than turbulence and passenger manifests. It was recording the truth behind the service. David leaned back, adjusting his posture to appear as though he were reviewing work documents. No one around him seemed to notice. The man in 2B was already snoring lightly, his stock reports sliding from his lap to the floor. Across the aisle, the woman in 3C typed steadily on her phone, her eyes flicking occasionally toward him with unspoken sympathy. Only Nina seemed to sense something deeper. She moved quietly along the aisle, her expression composed, but her gaze lingered a second longer whenever it passed his seat. She had seen enough to know, and perhaps she suspected that David was not as powerless as Carla believed. Carla, on the other hand, carried herself with unbroken confidence. She stood near the galley, chatting with one of her colleagues in low tones, occasionally glancing toward David as though to reassure herself that her authority remained intact. Every movement in her posture screamed certainty she was in control, and that was how it would stay. David clicked a key. A small icon blinked on the screen connection established. His audit was now active, feeding directly into a secure channel beyond the aircraft to NextCore servers, to eyes that would not ignore what was happening. Every word, every gesture, every choice Carla made tonight was being cataloged in high fidelity. A quiet satisfaction stirred inside him, though he kept it masked. He was not here to humiliate her. He was here to illuminate her choices, to hold them against the standard of fairness that she had abandoned the moment she placed that sandwich on his tray. The intercom crackled to life. Carla's voice floated through the cabin, cheerful and warm for the benefit of her audience. Ladies and gentlemen, as we settle into our cruising altitude, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of your flight. David closed his eyes, listening. Her voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of tone that reassured nervous flyers and reinforced the illusion of control. Yet, beneath it, he heard the undercurrent, the certainty that she had decided who mattered and who didn't. He thought again of his father, wiping grease from his hands after a 12-hour shift. "Son," his father had said once, "dignity is the one thing nobody can hand you and nobody should be able to take away. But people will try. Always be ready." The truth of those words pressed heavily on him now. Carla hadn't simply denied him a meal. She had tested whether he would surrender his dignity quietly. What she didn't know was that he had built his entire life on refusing to let such moments pass unchallenged. Nina reappeared at his row, offering another glass of water. "Here you go, sir," she said softly. Her eyes flickered to the laptop, then back to his face, curiosity and caution battling within her. David nodded. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady, but his gaze carried meaning. She seemed to understand, even if she couldn't put it into words. She lingered for just a second before moving on. The wheels of her cart humming gently across the carpet, Carla noticed. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she tracked Nina's movements, suspicion blooming. She was too seasoned not to sense when one of her attendants was wavering, and she had no tolerance for wavering. David closed the laptop with a soft click, letting it rest on the tray. The audit no longer required his attention. It was running on its own, silently and relentlessly, gathering everything it needed. His part now was to wait. He let his mind drift briefly, not to escape, but to ground himself. He pictured his wife back home in Atlanta, her laughter filling the kitchen as she stirred a pot of stew. He pictured his daughter, now in her 20s, standing on stage at her college graduation, her eyes bright with determination. These images steadied him, reminded him why he endured these battles over and over. It wasn't just for himself, it was for them, for everyone who deserved to walk into any space without having to prove they belonged. A small turbulence bump rattled the cabin again. Passengers shifted, glasses clinked. Carla made her way down the aisle, smiling at some, adjusting blankets for others, her performance flawless. When she reached David's row, her expression cooled. She tapped the sandwich box with a manicured finger. "Still haven't touched it?" she asked, her voice carrying a faint edge. David looked at the box, then back at her. "Not hungry," he replied evenly. Her smile tightened. "Suit yourself," she said, moving on. Behind her, the woman in 3C shook her head slightly, muttering under her breath, though too quietly for Carla to hear. David caught it, though 2 words laced with disapproval. Not right. He appreciated the solidarity, even in whispers. Small acknowledgments mattered. Time stretched on. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled into rest, but David remained alert. Every sense attuned to the unfolding tension. The evidence was secure. The question now was what would happen when the wheels touched the ground. He rested his hands in his lap, posture calm, expression unreadable. On the surface, he looked like a man waiting for nothing more than the end of a long flight. But inside, the quiet machinery of truth was already at work, and David Langston was ready for what came next. In the galley. Nina Torres stood rigid as Carla Bennett's voice cut into her like cold steel. "Torres," Carla snapped, her eyes narrowing, "you're spending too much time near 2A. Focus on the rest of the cabin. Don't get distracted." Nina forced a polite nod, but her hands clenched behind her back. Every instinct in her told her to speak, to point at the manifest still saved on her tablet, to tell Carla that David Langston had been denied a meal he was entitled to. But fear pressed down heavier than truth. Fear of losing her job, of being labeled insubordinate, of being shut out of the career she had worked so hard to enter. Carla leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was sharper than any shout. "Remember your place. You follow my lead, nothing else." Nina swallowed, her throat dry, and forced herself to murmur, "Yes, ma'am." Carla gave a satisfied smile and turned away, heels clicking against the floor as she returned to the aisle. Nina exhaled shakily, pressing her palms against the counter for steadiness. Her father's words rang again in her memory. "Respect is about dignity. Mija, don't let anyone take yours, and don't stay silent when they take someone else's." The truth of it twisted inside her. If she stayed quiet tonight, what did that make her? She slid her tablet out once more, fingers hovering above the screen. The manifest glowed clearly in front of her. Langston, David, meal salmon entree. She stared at it for long seconds, her pulse racing. She could screenshot it, log it, send it to someone, but before she could decide, a soft chime sounded on the device. Another line of text appeared. Just like before, truth needs witnesses. Her breath caught. Whoever was behind the messages, they were watching. Maybe it was a glitch, maybe something more. But the words struck her like a direct call. Her gaze lifted toward the cabin, toward David, who sat calmly in his seat, eyes fixed on the dark sky beyond the window. He hadn't touched the sandwich. He hadn't raised his voice. yet his presence alone filled the space with a kind of quiet defiance. Nina straightened, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and courage. She stepped back into the aisle, her hands steady now as she moved with purpose. She began serving drinks again, her smile polite, but every movement carried more weight. When she reached David's row, she paused. In a voice low enough for only him to hear, she said, "It's in the system. Your meal was confirmed." David turned his head, meeting her eyes. "I know," he said softly. His calmness held no surprise, only acknowledgement, as though he had expected her to reach this point. For the first time all evening, Nina felt a surge of relief. She wasn't carrying the truth alone anymore, but Carla wasn't blind. She saw the way Nina lingered, the subtle exchange of words, the spark of something she couldn't control. Her smile faltered for a moment before hardening again. She approached, her tone sharp but still coated in customer service varnish. "Torres, keep moving. Passengers are waiting." Nina hesitated, then forced herself to step away, the cart rattling softly as she pushed it down the aisle. But the spark had already lit inside her. She had spoken, however quietly, and once spoken, truth could not be unsaid. David leaned back in his seat, his mind processing every detail. He had seen people like Nina before, those caught between conscience and consequence. Many broke under the pressure, but some rose above it. He suspected she might be one of the latter. His laptop remained closed, but the audit continued invisibly, every camera and microphone feeding into NextCore's network. The evidence was no longer just his. It was already moving beyond the cabin, into systems that Carla couldn't touch. The cabin had grown quieter now. Some passengers slept, their breathing even beneath eye masks and blankets. Others scrolled lazily through entertainment screens. But an undercurrent of tension remained, like static in the air. People had noticed, even if they hadn't spoken. The injustice hung visible, unacknowledged but undeniable. The woman in 3C broke the silence, leaning slightly toward David. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice careful. "I couldn't help noticing. You didn't get served the same as everyone else." David regarded her calmly. "You noticed," he replied. She nodded, her eyes troubled. "It's not right. I thought maybe I should say something, but—" Her voice trailed off, weighted by the same hesitation that bound so many. "You already did," David said gently. His words carried no judgment, only reassurance. Noticing is the first step. Her expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing her face. She leaned back, her conscience eased by the knowledge that her silence hadn't gone completely unrecognized. The man in 2B stirred, glancing between them with mild irritation. "Honestly," he muttered, "people make too big a deal over little things. It's just a meal." David turned to him slowly. "It's never just a meal," he said. His tone was quiet, but the weight of it silenced the man more effectively than any argument could have. The man shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath, but he did not press further. Carla's eyes flicked back once more, catching the tension but choosing to ignore it. In her mind, she had already won. She had made her point, and no amount of sympathy or whispers would change the fact that she had drawn the line. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the line she had drawn was now etched permanently into the record. David rested his hands in his lap, his face calm. He could feel the shift in the cabin's energy. Small, subtle, but real. A spark had been lit, and sparks had a way of growing into something far larger. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight moved into the quiet hours. Most passengers had reclined their seats, headphones on, drifting into uneasy sleep. But under the hush of the engines, tension coiled tighter. Carla Bennett moved with deliberate grace, checking rows, adjusting blankets. But her gaze lingered often toward seat 2A, where David Langston remained awake, his posture calm yet immovable. Carla prided herself on control. She had spent years mastering the art of managing passengers, smoothing over complaints, projecting authority, but tonight, control felt like sand slipping through her fingers. The man in 2A hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded a thing. Yet somehow his silence pressed harder than shouting ever could. She stopped by his row once more. "Mr. Langston," she said, her tone overly polite. "I'd like to remind you that we're doing our best to ensure everyone is comfortable. If there's still an issue with your meal, I'll be glad to make a note for customer service after landing." David lifted his eyes to hers. "Customer service can't correct dignity," he replied evenly. The words landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through the quiet cabin. A few passengers stirred, pretending not to listen, yet clearly attentive. Carla's smile tightened, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." David's reply was soft, almost gentle. "You already did." Carla's composure cracked for just an instant. She straightened abruptly, her heels clicking as she turned away. But her face betrayed a flicker of unease. In the galley, Nina Torres stood frozen, clutching a stack of cups. She had overheard every word. The courage she had felt earlier swelled again, though fear still pressed hard against it. Carla's authority loomed like a shadow, but David's calm resistance gave her something steadier to hold on to. She set the cups down and stepped into the aisle, moving toward the rear cabin as though on routine duty, but her mind raced. If Carla confronted David again, if she escalated, what then? Nina had to choose continue in silence or stand with the truth. Half an hour passed. The cabin dozed, but David remained alert. His laptop, once again open on the tray, lines of code scrolled silently, feeding into servers that would soon make Carla's choices impossible to ignore. He wasn't impatient. He knew justice worked on its own timeline. Carla reappeared, this time without the polite mask. She leaned down closer than before, her voice sharp. "Listen, you may think your seat buys you leverage, but up here, I decide how things run. You got food, you're fine. Don't push this further." The remark drew audible gasps from nearby passengers who were no longer able to pretend sleep. The woman in 3C sat upright, staring at Carla in disbelief. Even the man in 2B, though smug earlier, shifted uneasily at the blatant hostility. David closed his laptop slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "What you've forgotten," he said, "is that power isn't in titles or uniforms, it's in choices, and yours have already been recorded." Carla blinked, confused. "Recorded? What are you talking about?" Before David could answer, Nina stepped forward from the galley. Her voice trembled at first, but she steadied it as she spoke. "He's right. I saw the manifest. His meal was confirmed. You denied it on purpose." The words cut through the cabin like lightning. Silence followed, heavy and electric. Passengers who had stayed quiet before now shifted, eyes widening, attention locked on the confrontation unfolding before them. Carla spun toward Nina, fury flashing across her face. "Torres, that's enough," she hissed. "We'll discuss this privately." Nina shook her head, her shoulders squaring as if something inside her had finally snapped free. "No, ma'am, not privately. Not when everyone saw what happened. Respect isn't optional." The tension broke open. The woman in 3C spoke next, her voice clear and steady. "She's telling the truth. I watched it happen. You served everyone else properly and gave them a box. That's not service, that's discrimination." A murmur spread through the cabin as other passengers shifted, some nodding, some whispering in agreement. The atmosphere had shifted. Silence no longer protected Carla. Her face reddened, her authority unraveling. She looked back at David, who sat still, watching her with that same unshakable calm. It was unbearable. "You think you can turn this into some spectacle," she spat quietly, struggling to keep her voice from rising too loud. David leaned forward slightly. "I don't need to turn it into anything. The truth stands on its own." Nina's heart raced, her hands trembling but her spine straight. She had spoken, and now there was no going back. Fear remained, but it was joined by something stronger, the knowledge that she had finally chosen her dignity over silence. Passengers' eyes shifted between them, waiting. The confrontation had laid bare what many had tried to ignore, and the weight of it pressed down on every corner of the cabin. Carla opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Authority, once so absolute, had slipped from her grasp. She turned sharply, retreating toward the galley, her heels clicking louder than before. David exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition. The spark had grown into fire, and fire, once lit, could not be contained. The atmosphere in first class was no longer serene. It was charged, like the air before a storm. Passengers whispered among themselves, some openly glancing at David Langston, others stealing looks toward the galley where Carla Bennett had retreated. What had been quiet discomfort had now become undeniable tension, humming across every row. David sat motionless, his hands folded neatly in his lap. But inside, he felt the shift as clearly as a pilot feels a change in altitude. The truth had been spoken aloud by Nina Torres, by the passenger in 3C, and once spoken, it could not be pulled back into silence. The man in 2B shifted uneasily, clearing his throat. For the first time since takeoff, his smug expression faltered. He muttered, "Maybe it's not such a big deal. Maybe people are overreacting." But his words fell flat, no longer carrying the weight they had before. Even he seemed unconvinced. Nina stood near the aisle, her heart still pounding from the courage it had taken to speak. She had expected Carla to crush her immediately, to silence her with threats or punishment. But instead, Carla had fled, her authority shaken. That alone gave Nina strength she hadn't felt before. She straightened her posture, her shoulders no longer hunched with fear. From the galley, Carla re-emerged, her face composed but pale. She forced a smile as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. Please rest assured that we are committed to providing the best possible service to all of you." The words were smooth, but her tone betrayed strain. She glanced toward David, expecting perhaps that he would nod and let the matter close. But he remained still, his expression unreadable. Then the woman in 3C spoke again, louder this time. It wasn't a misunderstanding. We all saw what you did." A ripple of agreement spread murmurs of assent, heads nodding. Other passengers who had remained silent now found their voices. "Yeah," someone muttered from the back. "That wasn't right." Carla's eyes darted nervously. Her power in the cabin, once so secure, was unraveling in real time. She opened her mouth to respond, but Nina stepped forward, her voice steady. "The manifest confirmed Mr. Langston's meal. I checked it myself. He was entitled to the same service as everyone else." Carla snapped her head toward her, fury flaring. "Torres, that's enough. You don't know what you're talking about." But Nina didn't flinch. "I do know," she said, louder this time. "And so does he." She gestured toward David. The eyes of the cabin turned toward him again, waiting. David let the silence hang for a long moment before speaking, his voice calm but resonant. "This isn't about a meal. It's about being told, once again, that I don't belong, and every person in this cabin knows it." The words cut deeper than any accusation. Passengers shifted, their faces reflecting the weight of what he said. Some looked ashamed for having stayed silent so long. Others looked emboldened, their discomfort now transformed into quiet outrage. Carla's voice cracked slightly as she tried to regain footing. "You're twisting this. I was only following procedures." David tilted his head, his eyes steady. "Show me the procedure that says dignity is optional." A hush followed, thick and unbroken. Carla had no answer. Nina's chest swelled with something fierce relief, pride, courage. She had stood beside the truth, and now David's words carried it further, beyond her own trembling voice. In that moment, the intercom chimed. A calm voice from the cockpit filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've received a communication from ground operations. We'll be making an unscheduled review upon landing. Please remain in your seats and enjoy the rest of the flight." The timing was no coincidence. David's audit was already reaching its destination, pulling the airline itself into the truth. Carla paled further, her lips pressing into a thin line. The passengers exchanged glances. Some whispered, others nodded. They understood something bigger was happening. Carla turned sharply, retreating to the galley once more. Her confidence was gone. In its place was panic, though she tried to mask it with busy work shuffling cups, adjusting trays, anything to keep her hands moving. David leaned back, his face calm. He had not needed to shout, to demand, to threaten. The truth had spoken for itself, and now the weight of accountability was bearing down. Nina returned to the galley briefly, her steps light despite the storm. She had crossed a line, and there would be consequences, she knew that. But for the first time, she felt free of the chains of silence. In the cabin, the woman in 3C smiled faintly at David, her eyes shining with respect. Others looked at him with something close to admiration. He had carried himself with dignity, where others might have exploded in anger. And in doing so, he had revealed more than just one woman's prejudice. He had revealed a system's failure. The engines hummed steadily as the plane cut through the night sky, but inside, the unraveling continued. Carla's authority, once unshakable, had crumbled. The passengers, once passive, had found their voices, and Nina, once fearful, had stepped fully into courage. David closed his eyes, resting his head back against the seat. The hardest part was over. The rest would come when the wheels touched down. The cabin had grown restless, though no one dared raise their voice above a murmur. The captain's announcement still echoed in everyone's minds, an unscheduled review upon landing. Those words carried weight. They meant accountability was already waiting at the airport, and the unease sat heavy in the air. Carla Bennett remained in the galley, fussing with trays she had organized twice already. Her hands trembled despite her best efforts to appear composed. The certainty she had built her career on authority, control, the ability to silence complaints was gone. She could feel it unraveling thread by thread, and the quiet glances from passengers told her they had seen the shift too. David Langston sat steady in his seat, the picture of composure. The laptop was closed now, but the work was already done. He had set the system in motion. The evidence had flown far beyond this aircraft. He did not need to convince anyone. He simply needed to wait. Nina Torres stood near the galley curtain, her heart hammering as she watched Carla pace. Every instinct told her she had crossed a dangerous line by speaking out. Yet a strange calm came with it. The truth was no longer hers alone to carry. It was alive in the cabin now, undeniable, breathing in every whispered conversation. Finally, Carla stepped forward again, her voice low but sharp as she approached David. "What exactly are you playing at?" she hissed, careful that nearby passengers couldn't hear. "You think you can humiliate me in front of this cabin. You have no idea who you're dealing with." David turned his head, meeting her glare with a calm that unnerved her. "On the contrary," he said softly, "it's you who doesn't know who you're dealing with." Carla blinked, caught off guard by the firmness of his tone. She opened her mouth to retort, but David continued, his voice even, controlled, yet carrying the quiet power of truth. "I built the systems that hold this airline together," he said. "Every camera, every microphone, every manifest file flows through NextCore. While you were serving champagne, this cabin was recording, and while you were choosing who mattered and who didn't, the truth was already leaving this plane." Her face drained of color. For the first time that night, her certainty collapsed entirely. "You're lying," she whispered, though her voice shook. David leaned back, folding his hands. "You'll see soon enough." Passengers nearby had caught enough of the exchange to lean closer. The woman in 3C gasped softly, her eyes widening. The man in 2B shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smugness now replaced by the sinking realization that the stranger beside him was far more than he had assumed. Carla's lips parted as though to argue, but no words came. She turned sharply and strode back toward the galley, her composure gone. Nina's breath caught. She had suspected David wasn't just another passenger, but hearing him speak the truth aloud confirmed it. This wasn't simply a matter of a denied meal, it was bigger, much bigger. The minutes that followed dragged slowly. The engines hummed. The lights remained dim, but no one in first class was at ease anymore. People stole glances at David, whispers spreading like quiet currents. He didn't move, didn't speak further, simply sat with the stillness of a man who had nothing to prove. When the intercom chimed again, the captain's voice was calm but unmistakably deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be aware that upon arrival, representatives from corporate operations will be boarding to conduct an immediate review. We appreciate your cooperation." A ripple ran through the cabin. This was no ordinary landing. Something was waiting, and everyone knew who it involved. Nina's chest tightened. She wondered what would happen to her if Carla would twist the story to save herself. if her own words would be turned against her. But when she glanced at David, she found reassurance in his calm expression. He didn't look worried. He looked prepared. Carla, on the other hand, had gone pale. She busied herself with meaningless tasks, but her eyes darted constantly toward the front of the plane, as though searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The woman in 3C leaned across the aisle, whispering to David, You're really the one who runs NextCore." David nodded slightly. Yes. Her lips parted, astonishment clear in her eyes. "And she treated you like that." "She did," David said evenly, "and tonight it will cost more than she realizes." The woman sat back, her gaze lingering on him with new respect. Around the cabin, other passengers exchanged looks. The quiet man who had accepted humiliation without protest was, in fact, the architect of the very systems the airline depended on. The revelation landed like thunder. Nina clutched her tablet, her pulse racing. She scrolled quickly, confirming what she already knew: the manifest, the meal request, the discrepancy, but now she saw something else, an incoming lock on her system. A faint notification at the edge of the screen. It bore the NextCore logo. The audit had reached her device too. Evidence was everywhere. She lifted her eyes to David. He didn't look at her directly, but something in his calm demeanor told her he already knew she had seen it. The truth was no longer in his hands alone. It was in the system, in the records, in the minds of every witness in that cabin. Carla's empire of control had collapsed, and she hadn't even realized when the ground gave way beneath her feet. The engines roared as the plane began its gradual descent toward San Francisco. Lights flickered on, illuminating weary faces, but no one felt ordinary fatigue. The cabin brimmed with anticipation, with the heavy knowledge that something significant was about to unfold. David reached for the sandwich box, lifted it gently, and set it on the empty seat beside him. He looked at it for a moment, then closed his eyes, letting the hum of the descent fill the silence. It wasn't about the sandwich. It had never been. It was about the story it told, and soon that story would no longer belong only to him. The seatbelt sign flicked on with a soft chime, pulling the cabin into a hush. Passengers stirred, adjusting their seats upright, tucking away blankets, and fastening belts. But, unlike most landings, this silence wasn't filled with sleepy anticipation of arrival. It was taut, expectant, charged with the weight of what they all knew was coming. David Langston adjusted his belt calmly, his movements unhurried. Outwardly, he looked no different from any other passenger preparing for descent. Yet inwardly, he felt the stillness of a man whose course had already been set. The truth was in motion, and nothing could stop it now. The descent began, the engine's pitch changing as the aircraft tilted slightly downward. The lights of San Francisco began to glitter faintly on the horizon, a sea of golden stars against the dark earth. The view might have been beautiful under other circumstances, but tonight it felt like a stage one where justice was about to play out. Carla Bennett walked briskly down the aisle, checking belts with a smile that looked more like a grimace. She leaned down toward David briefly, her voice sharp beneath the performance. "When we land, you'll regret making this a spectacle. Do you have any idea how badly you've embarrassed yourself?" David turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. His voice was calm, quiet, but carried the weight of something immovable. "The only people embarrassed tonight are the ones who chose arrogance over decency." Carla's jaw tightened. She straightened and moved on quickly, her shoes clicking against the floor, her mask of professionalism cracking more with each step. From her jump seat, Nina Torres watched in silence, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had spoken her truth, but fear still tugged at her. What would happen when the doors opened? Would Carla twist the narrative, turning blame onto her, or would the truth hold steady under the scrutiny waiting on the ground? As the plane descended lower, passengers whispered among themselves. The woman in 3C leaned across the aisle once more, her voice low. "Mr. Langston, whatever happens down there, just know some of us saw the truth tonight, and we won't forget it." David inclined his head gently. "That's enough," he said. "The truth never needs everyone, just enough to carry it forward." The wheels hit the runway with a heavy thud, bouncing once before settling. Engines roared as the aircraft slowed, the cabin rocking forward, then steadying as brakes gripped the tarmac. The landing was smooth, but no one clapped, no one cheered. They were waiting. As the plane taxied toward its gate, the intercom crackled once again. The captain's voice was firm, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, upon docking, please remain seated. Representatives from corporate operations will be boarding. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." Carla's face drained further. She forced herself to keep smiling at passengers, but her hands shook slightly as she collected stray cups. She whispered to another attendant, her voice tight with panic. "Say nothing. Let me handle this." Nina lowered her eyes but felt no intention of staying silent. Her courage, once buried under fear, had found its footing. The plane slowed to a stop, the seatbelt sign still glowing overhead. Outside, the jet bridge extended toward the aircraft. But before the familiar ding that released passengers, the door opened and 3 figures in tailored suits stepped aboard. Their presence was immediate, undeniable. Corporate operations had arrived. The lead representative, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, scanned the cabin briefly before speaking in a clear, steady voice. "Good evening. Passengers, we apologize for the delay. We need to conduct a brief review before disembarkation." Carla stepped forward quickly, plastering on her most professional smile. "Of course, I'll be happy to assist. There's been a minor misunderstanding, nothing unusual." The woman cut her off gently but firmly. "We'll determine that ourselves." She turned her gaze to David. "Mr. Langston, if you would remain seated for now, we'll need to speak with you directly." Whispers rippled through the cabin. The name confirmed what many already suspected. This wasn't just a passenger. This was someone important. Carla's composure cracked. "You know him," she blurted, her voice carrying more than she intended. The representative's eyes cooled. "Of course. Mr. Langston's company designed the infrastructure we use daily. Tonight's review is already underway in our systems." Gasps filled the cabin. Passengers looked at David with widened eyes, the full weight of the revelation sinking in. The quiet man with the untouched sandwich was not just another traveler. He was the mind behind the technology holding their airline together. Carla staggered back a step, her mouth opening but no words forming. David sat still, his hands folded, his face calm. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded recognition. Yet now the truth stood fully revealed. The representative gestured to the attendants. "We'll be reviewing service protocols immediately. For now, we ask passengers to remain patient as we begin." The cabin was silent, every eye locked on the unfolding scene, Carla's certainty, Her control, her arrogance, all of it had evaporated. Nina exhaled slowly, a quiet rush of relief filling her chest. The truth had held. She had not been silenced. And soon, Carla would answer not just to her, but to everyone. David leaned back, his eyes closing briefly as though he were simply resting. But inside, he knew this was only the beginning. Accountability had landed with them, and the story of what happened on the Flight 708 was about to reach far beyond the cabin's walls. The aisle felt narrower than ever as the three corporate representatives moved forward, their polished shoes clicking against the cabin floor. Passengers leaned subtly toward the aisle, their curiosity barely contained. It was no longer just about one man and one meal. They sensed it, the weight of something bigger, something systemic, playing out in real time before their eyes. Carla Bennett stood stiffly, her uniform immaculate, but her hands betraying a slight tremor. She forced a smile, addressing the lead representative with false confidence. "I assure you, there's been nothing unusual here tonight. Perhaps a slight miscommunication, but," the woman raised a hand, silencing her gently but firmly. "Ms. Bennett, we're not here for explanations. We're here for facts, and the facts are already in motion." She gestured toward David Langston, still seated calmly in 2A. "Mr. Langston has provided us with a direct line to the audit logs. Every moment of this flight is already under review." The cabin erupted in whispers. People turned toward David, some with astonishment, some with admiration, others with shame for having doubted him earlier. David didn't move. His face remained composed, his posture steady, but his silence carried more authority than any speech could. Carla's smile faltered. She darted a look at Nina Torres, her eyes sharp with accusation. "She's been undermining me all night, feeding him stories, trying to make me look bad. You can't trust what she says." Nina froze, her heart hammering. For a moment, fear clawed at her throat. But then she remembered the flicker of courage she had felt earlier, the relief of speaking the truth aloud. She lifted her chin. "I didn't feed him anything. I told the truth. The manifest listed his meal clearly, and you denied it." Passengers nodded, murmuring their agreement. The woman in 3C added firmly, "I saw it myself. She served everyone else properly and gave him a box." "That's not a mistake." Another passenger chimed in from the back. "Yeah, it was obvious." The tide had turned, Carla's authority had collapsed, and the cabin itself had become the witness. The lead representative's gaze sharpened. "Ms. Bennett, you'll step aside for now. A full investigation will follow. For the moment, your service is suspended." Carla's mouth opened in protest, but no words came. Her face reddened, her chest heaving as though she wanted to shout, but under the weight of evidence and witness, she found nothing to stand on. Nina watched in awe as the woman who had towered over her for months demanding obedience, instilling fear, now stood stripped of power. Relief flooded her, mingled with disbelief. It was happening. The second representative, a younger man with sharp eyes, spoke next. "And to be clear, this isn't just about one flight attendant. We've already found patterns in the system meal assignments altered, service records inconsistent, complaints buried." He paused, his gaze sweeping the cabin. What happened tonight wasn't isolated. Gasps filled the air. Passengers exchanged stunned looks. What had begun as one man's mistreatment had now cracked open something far deeper, a culture of neglect and discrimination woven into the airline's very operations. David finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. That's why silence matters. Every time someone looks away, every time a complaint gets ignored, the system learns it can get away with it. Tonight, it learned something different. The words resonated through the cabin. Even those who had remained silent earlier now nodded, their faces reflecting the truth of his statement. The lead representative inclined her head respectfully. "Mr. Langston, we appreciate your patience and your intervention. Without it, this might never have come to light." David met her gaze steadily. "This was never about me alone. It's about every passenger who's ever been told, in one way or another, that they don't belong. If the system changes, then this flight was worth the cost." Nina felt tears sting her eyes. His calm strength, his refusal to let anger consume him, his insistence on turning humiliation into justice, it moved her deeply. She had spoken her truth because of him. But now she realized he had been fighting not just for himself, but for all of them. Carla sank into the jump seat near the galley, her hands covering her face. Her shoulders trembled, though whether with anger or shame, no one could tell. The representatives turned to Nina. "Ms. Torres, your cooperation has been noted. We'll need your formal statement, but you should know this standing up when others stay silent takes courage. Don't underestimate the value of that." Nina's breath hitched. For months she had felt invisible, overshadowed by Carla's dominance. Tonight, for the first time, she felt seen. Passengers began to clap softly, the sound hesitant at first but quickly growing. It wasn't the awkward applause of a landing. It was something different, something raw, appreciative, directed toward David, toward Nina, toward the moment itself. David lifted a hand slightly, quieting them. "This isn't about applause," he said. "It's about responsibility. Remember what you saw tonight. Carry it with you. Don't stay silent the next time you see someone diminished." The cabin hushed again, his words sinking deep. The lead representative nodded once, then signaled to her team. "We'll escort Ms. Bennett off the aircraft now. Passengers, thank you for your patience. You'll be free to disembark shortly." Two attendants guided Carla toward the door. She walked stiffly, her chin raised, but her eyes betrayed the fear of a woman who had finally met the weight of her own choices. David remained seated, his gaze steady on the forward cabin. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply watched as accountability, long overdue, was carried out in front of those who had witnessed its necessity. The engines powered down, the jet bridge locked into place, and for the first time since takeoff, the cabin exhaled as one. The cabin door opened wider now, not for passengers but for the sharp, unmistakable transition of authority. Uniformed ground staff stepped inside, nodding briskly to the corporate representatives who had already taken charge. The atmosphere in first class was taut with anticipation. No one moved, no one unbuckled. The passengers sensed instinctively that what they had witnessed was only the beginning. Carla Bennett was led down the aisle toward the exit, her chin tilted upward in defiance, but her eyes darting left and right, betraying fear. Some passengers looked away, others stared openly. A few even shook their heads, their disappointment plain. Nina Torres kept her gaze steady, watching the woman who had dominated her life for months finally stripped of the authority she had wielded like a weapon. When the door sealed again, a hush filled the cabin. Passengers looked to David Langston as though waiting for him to speak, to define the meaning of what they had seen. But David remained silent, his expression calm, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. He wasn't gloating, wasn't savoring Carla's downfall. He was waiting for something larger. The lead corporate representative returned to his row. Mr. Langston, the preliminary findings confirm everything you flagged. Altered service logs, inconsistent treatment records, targeted dismissals of complaints. We'll be expanding the investigation across multiple routes. David nodded slightly. Good. But don't just look for proof of misconduct. Look for the people who stayed silent. Silence is what makes discrimination sustainable. The woman studied him with quiet respect. You have our word. This won't be brushed aside. Passengers stirred, murmuring. The man in 2B cleared his throat awkwardly, then leaned toward David. Listen, I might have dismissed it earlier, said it was just a meal. I was wrong. His voice faltered, but he pressed on. It wasn't just a meal. I see that now. David met his eyes, not unkindly. Growth starts with admitting when you're wrong. Don't stop there. Next time you see it happening, speak sooner. The man swallowed, nodding, chastened but grateful for the chance to make amends. Nina sat quietly, her mind still racing. She thought of all the flights before this one, all the times she had swallowed her discomfort, chosen obedience over conscience. She thought of her father's words about dignity, and for the first time, she felt she had honored them. Passengers began to gather their belongings now, the intercom granting permission to disembark. But no one rushed for the overhead bins the way they normally would. They moved slowly, deliberately, still processing the night's events. Some glanced again at David, as if imprinting the image of his calm defiance into memory. As the cabin emptied, Nina lingered near the galley, watching him. When the last passengers had gone, she stepped closer. Mr. Langston, she said softly, I just want to thank you, not just for standing up for yourself, but for showing me that silence isn't the only option. David regarded her with steady eyes. You found your voice tonight. Nina, hold on to it. The world doesn't change because of one loud voice. It changes when enough quiet voices choose to speak. Her throat tightened. She nodded, fighting back tears. The representatives escorted David off the plane separately, leading him through a quiet corridor instead of the crowded terminal. Cameras flashed from a distance, reporters catching wind of the unusual review, but the corporate team shielded him from the chaos. He moved with unhurried steps, every inch of him radiating composure. Inside a private lounge, executives awaited him, faces pale, voices careful. They knew who he was, knew what his company controlled, and they understood the implications of what had happened aboard Skylux 708. One executive began nervously. Mr. Langston, we want to assure you that this was an isolated incident. It doesn't reflect our values. David raised a hand, silencing him gently. Don't insult me with platitudes. What happened tonight is woven into your system. If you want to prove otherwise, then change the system. Root it out. From training to accountability to leadership. The room was silent. Executives shifted uncomfortably, but no one argued. They knew he was right. David continued, his tone even, his words deliberate. And understand this, NextCore doesn't just supply your infrastructure. We monitor it. If your culture doesn't change, the evidence won't stay buried. Not anymore. It was not a threat. It was a promise spoken with absolute calm, and the executives knew better than to challenge it. Later, as the terminal emptied into the quiet hours of the night, David stepped outside into the cool California air. The city lights shimmered in the distance, alive and restless. He drew in a slow breath, letting the night wash over him. The events of the flight replayed in fragments the sting of being denied. The courage in Nina's trembling voice, the hush of passengers realizing the truth. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something quieter, deeper, a conviction that what had happened tonight mattered not because it punished one person, but because it revealed a fault line in a system that needed to be rebuilt. Nina emerged from the terminal a short while later, her bag slung over her shoulder. She spotted him near the curb, hesitating before approaching. "Do you think they'll really change?" she asked, her voice uncertain. David looked at her, then at the lights flickering across the bay. Change doesn't happen overnight, but tonight they learned something they can't unlearn, and so did you. She let out a shaky laugh. "I think I learned more in one flight than in all my training." He smiled faintly. That's how it works sometimes. One moment can teach more than 100 lectures. They stood in silence for a while, the night air wrapping around them. Nina finally squared her shoulders. "I don't know what comes next for me, but I know I won't go back to silence." David nodded, his expression warm. That's enough to start with. A car pulled up for him, sleek and waiting. He offered her a final nod before stepping inside. As the vehicle pulled away, Nina watched until the taillights vanished into the city. The night felt different now. Heavy, yes, but also filled with a strange, fragile hope. She had witnessed dignity defended, silence broken, justice demanded. And though she was only one person, she felt the spark inside her burning brighter than ever before. The city was quiet in the early hours, its streets washed in the glow of sodium lamps. From the back seat of his car, David Langston gazed at the skyline of San Francisco, a city that had witnessed so many of his victories and battles. Yet tonight's memory lingered differently. It wasn't the sting of being denied a meal that replayed in his mind, but the faces Nina's trembling defiance, the passengers' awakening recognition, Carla's unraveling composure. The car rolled to a stop in front of his apartment tower overlooking the bay. David stepped out slowly, briefcase in hand, his body tired but his mind alert. He paused by the glass doors, catching his reflection. For years, he had cultivated composure as armor, but tonight had reminded him that composure wasn't just protection. It was also power, the kind that disarmed arrogance, the kind that invited others to step into courage. Inside his apartment, he loosened his tie and poured a glass of water, standing by the wide windows. He let the silence surround him, heavy yet clarifying. The humiliation he'd endured could have broken into anger, but instead it had crystallized into something sharper resolve. He thought of Nina Torres, of her choice to speak when silence would have been safer. Her courage had reminded him of his own beginnings. The first time he had dared to stand against a system larger than himself. He made a mental note she was not to be forgotten. Somewhere, somehow, he would ensure her bravery was rewarded. The next morning brought headlines. News outlets had already picked up fragments of the story first-class controversy. Airline faces audit after CEO mistreatment. Witnesses claimed discrimination in Skylux's flight. Reporters speculated wildly, some focusing on David's status, others on the broader cultural implications. The airline's stock dipped by midday, its executives scrambling to contain the damage. David ignored the noise. He moved through his day with deliberate focus, holding meetings at NextCore, reviewing reports, and addressing his team. He didn't need to correct the narrative swirling outside. The truth would unfold on its own. By afternoon, his office phone rang. It was the lead corporate representative from the flight. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice measured but tinged with urgency. "The board has convened an emergency session. They're requesting your presence." David agreed without hesitation. Within hours, he was seated in a sleek boardroom, executives lined around the table, their faces pale, charts, complaint records, and audit findings filled the screens. The scope was undeniable systemic bias, repeated incidents swept under the rug, and a culture that rewarded silence over accountability. One executive leaned forward nervously. "We're prepared to issue an apology, Mr. Langston, publicly, immediately, and we'd like to invite you to consult on a new cultural reform initiative." David studied them in silence for a moment before answering. An apology is a start, but it's meaningless without change. If you're serious, you'll do more than consult. You'll rebuild from the ground up. The room was still. Another executive cleared his throat. "And if we don't," David's gaze was steady, unblinking, "then your infrastructure won't hold. NextCore's partnership is not unconditional. We build systems of trust. If you refuse to uphold that, we'll withdraw, and you know what that means for your operations." The words were delivered without anger, without threat, but the weight of them was undeniable. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, each calculating the cost of resistance. Finally, the chairman exhaled heavily. "You'll have what you need: authority, resources, access. We can't afford not to." David inclined his head slightly. Then, perhaps this humiliation was worth it. Not for me, but for what it forces you to face. Later, walking out of the boardroom, David felt no triumph. Change was a long road, and promises in polished rooms were fragile. But the spark had been struck, and he would ensure it was not extinguished. That evening, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from Nina. "I don't know what happens next for me, but thank you for reminding me that silence isn't the only choice." David typed back simply, "You reminded yourself. Don't forget it." He set the phone down, leaning back in his chair. He thought again of the woman in 3C, the man in 2B. The passengers who had witnessed the truth unfold in that cabin. Each of them had been changed, however slightly. That was how justice worked, not always in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of smaller awakenings. Days later, footage surfaced from the onboard cameras, leaked through channels David hadn't directly touched. The world saw the quiet injustice of the denied meal, the exchange between Carla and Nina, the moment passengers found their voices. The story went viral not as a tale of revenge, but as one of dignity, courage, and accountability. Social media buzzed with the hashtag, "Not Just a Meal." People shared their own stories of being dismissed, overlooked, diminished. It became a collective reckoning, not about luxury travel but about everyday dignity. Through it all, David remained composed, offering no sensational interviews, no fiery speeches. When asked, he spoke simply, "Respect is not optional. Systems are made of people, and people can choose better." Months later, Skylux launched its reform program, with David advising quietly from behind the scenes. Nina, too, found her life altered, no longer the timid attendant afraid of speaking. She became a voice in training programs, reminding recruits that service was not about hierarchy, but about humanity. For David, the incident became another chapter in a life marked by resilience. Yet, it wasn't the scandal that stayed with him most. It was the small moments, Nina's trembling voice finding steadiness, the passengers' murmurs growing into solidarity, the hush of a cabin realizing the weight of truth. One evening, standing again by his window overlooking the bay, David thought of his father's words, how dignity wasn't given but claimed. He smiled faintly, sipping his water, knowing that on Skylux 708 dignity had been claimed not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told, in ways subtle or overt, that they didn't belong. The city lights shimmered, restless and alive. Change was never easy, never fast, but it had begun, and sometimes one flight, one meal, one voice was enough to ignite it. Life often tests us not in grand battles, but in small quiet moments where our dignity is questioned. On the surface, being denied a meal may seem trivial, but for many, it mirrors those times we've been overlooked, dismissed, or treated as if our worth was negotiable. The lesson is simple, yet profound silence in the face of disrespect only strengthens injustice. David Langston's calm defiance reminds us that true strength is not about shouting louder, but about holding firm to our dignity when it is challenged. And Nina's choice to speak up shows us that courage often begins as a whisper. For older generations who have faced countless moments of being told to accept and endure, this story offers a reminder it is never too late to choose differently. Respect is not given. It is upheld through every small act of truth and courage. And when one person stands, others find their voices too. That is how change, real and lasting, begins. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to support our channel like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful story. Together, we can keep these voices alive.